verses because, you know, what religion existed when this took place? Um, there wasn't one. It was God's way. It was God's way. You know, today we are gathered together on a day not chosen by any man. You know, it's not a day that we chose. It's not a day that some other man chose. It's not a day that was chosen by some great church conference hundreds or thousands of years ago. But here you and I sit on the day chosen by our Creator God to worship Him. It's the day He rested from His work. You know, it's the day He blessed. It's the day He sanctified. And what day is it? It's the seventh day. We can go through the book of Genesis and we can read in the scriptures right before these how God spent 6 days creating everything from the smallest insect to the largest tree, to the things that you and I can see, to the things we can't see, to things in the water that swim, to things in the air that fly. He created them. And He created them in the Garden of Eden. And some say, and I can't really argue against this, that the last thing God created was the Sabbath. After He had created all of these things, you know, and you've heard the slang term, you know, He put a cherry on top, right? Well, the cherry on top was He created the Sabbath. He rested from His work. He rested from all the things that He had spent time doing. Now, the Bible tells us on the first day He did this, on the second day He did this, on the third day He did this. And I'm not here to argue whether those were actual days of 24 hours, or as some people say that, you know, that day was 1,000 years, you know, or what have you. He created them. He created them. And at the end of creating and doing all that work, He rested. And He chose a day. Now let's go over to the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 31. Exodus chapter 31. And in Exodus chapter 31, we're going to begin at verse 12 and read a few verses here. And Exodus chapter 31 and verse 12, and it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Truly you shall keep my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, to know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you." Not a holiday, it's holy. "Everyone that defiles it shall surely be put to death. But whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. Now, 6 days may work be done, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest. Holy to the Lord, and whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death." And in verse 16, "Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant." And that means forever. And look at verse 17. "It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day He rested and was refreshed." And in verse 18, "And He gave to Moses, when he had made an end of speaking with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tablets of the testimony, the tablets of stone written by the finger of God," what we call the 10 Commandments. He gave him these tablets. And as we know, the 4th commandment is, "Thou shalt remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy." And He gave Moses these tablets, and he wrote them in not on a piece of paper, not on something that decays or what have you, but he wrote them with his finger in stone, something that's permanent, you know. And, you know, the Sabbath is a sign between God and his people. Every week we're reminded of the importance of God's Sabbath. And every year we're reminded of the importance of God's holy days, which are what we refer to as annual Sabbaths. This is a quote that I've looked up last night to put and for us to think about. And I know it's a quote you've heard before, but Winston Churchill, he was the fearless leader of Great Britain during World War II. You know, there's been a lot of books written about Winston Churchill, a lot of movies made about Winston Churchill. But one of the quotes that he made was this: "I will say that he must have a blind soul who cannot see that some great purpose and design is being worked out here below, of which we have the honor to be faithful servants." Now, Winston Churchill was not necessarily talking about the same thing that you and I are talking about, but in some ways he was. You know, the world was in the middle of a war against good versus evil. If there's ever been a just war, World War II would have definitely been one of the ones where the Nazis were killing millions upon millions of people just for their religious beliefs, and other groups of people that were lumped in there as well. And the whole world was fighting against it. Just pure evil. And Winston Churchill looking at saying there's a great purpose being worked out here, and that we're faithful servants to be helping to put down this evil. Well, do you believe that a great purpose is being worked out in your life? Have you given it much thought? Or have we become like the Israelites soon after they left Egypt? We just went through God's holy days. We started early in the spring with Passover. We had all of our weekly Sabbaths mixed in, you know. We went through Pentecost, or should I say Passover, the days of unleavened bread, Pentecost, you know. We went through all of God's holy days. We went through the Feast of Tabernacles, the last great day. And on the last great day, what takes place? The news goes crazy. Israel's attacked. And there's been plenty of attacks. And of course, just like on 9/11, a lot of people thought, is this the beginning of the end? And I'm sure if I would have been alive when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, there were probably people at that time saying, is this the beginning of the end? And this is a constant thing that goes on. Let's go over to Exodus chapter 32, just, you know, a couple of paragraphs down, but Exodus chapter 32 and begin in verse 1. And I say this because have we become like the Israelites not soon after they left Egypt? And when the people saw, and I'm starting in chapter 32, and when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountains, so Moses went up to meet with God, and he delayed to come down from the mountain. And the people gathered themselves to Aaron, and they said to him, "Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." You know, Moses has been gone for a while. And they were really wrong with their thinking to say that Moses brought them out of Egypt. And I'm sure that would have aggravated Moses as well, because God brought them out of Egypt. He was using Moses and Aaron. But this is what they were saying. The man that had been their leader was not visible anymore. And they had already lost faith. And they look at Aaron and they say, "Make us a god." And Aaron said to them, "Break off the golden earrings which are in your ears of your wives and your sons and of your daughters, and bring them to me." So all this gold and silver that they had acquired when they left Egypt when the Egyptians threw it at them saying, please just get out of here, because the Egyptians had went through plague after plague after plague. Now they're being told, give us this gold, we're going to melt it down and we're going to make a god. And all the people broke off their golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron, and he took them from their hand and fashioned it with engraving tools and made a molten calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Can you believe that? Not only are they making a golden calf, an idol, but they're now, because Moses delayed, they are now giving all the praise for the various things that took place, the miracles that they saw, the firstborn dying, the bulls, the frogs, the water turning to blood, all of these things. And what do they say? These are the gods, O Israel, that delivered you from Egypt. And in verse 5, and when Aaron saw the calf, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is the feast to the Lord. When did men begin to make their own holidays? When did men begin to decide what day they worship God and how they worship God? Well, it was going on way before this, because the Egyptians had multiple gods and multiple holidays. But as we can see, Israel did it too. Because here Aaron is, shortly after creating a golden calf and giving it the praise for something that God did, he says, tomorrow is a feast of God. And in verse 6, and they rose up early on the next morning and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down and eat and drank and rose up to play. And the Lord said to Moses, now Moses is still up in the mountains, go get down, for your people, who you brought out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. Now you imagine Moses going, what? They've corrupted themselves, and he's scratching his head. What's going on? I left them. Aaron's in control, and I'm sure that if we had a document of his private conversation with Aaron, and it was like, listen, hang tight. I'm going to talk with God. Don't do anything crazy. Keep everybody calm. And in verse 8, and they turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made a molten calf and have worshipped it. So God is telling Moses what's going on, and has sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who have brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Can you imagine the look on Moses' face when God is saying, your people are doing this? And in verse 9, and the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. God's people are stiff-necked people. And this was just days, if not months, from the time they had been delivered. And if we understand correctly, this is around the time of Pentecost that this takes place. And drop down to verse 10. And this is God speaking. Now leave me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I will make just a great nation of you. So in other words, we all have fuses. We all have, that line in the sand of, all right, I can take this, I can take that, but if you cross this line, if you burn this bridge, well, God was right there at it, evidently. He was furious. And he looked at Moses and said, basically, you know what? I'll just make a great nation out of you. I'm just going to kill all them. And rightfully so. If he would have decided to do so, he would have been in his right. He's God. He's perfect. The Israelites had a great purpose, just like Winston Churchill said. And yet God was going to just bypass them altogether. Why? Because they weren't taking advantage of it. They were stiff-necked. They had just witnessed miracle after miracle, miracles that you and I have never seen. But at some point, and this is what you and I hopefully understand, at some point, a person's faith has to be tested. They had seen countless miracles, miracles that you can't deny. When you wake up and the whole community around you has dead people in their homes, their firstborn son, their firstborn daughter, or a father or mother, and their cattle are dead, but yours is not because you put blood on your doorpost, you can't deny that. They had seen miracles after miracles, and yet they get out there and Moses delays, and what do? They make a golden image. They give that golden image the praise that God deserves, and they begin being drunk and singing and dancing, and who knows what else was taking place. Will they continue in the way when no one is looking? You know, there comes a point where we have to be tested in our faith. God wants to see what we will do. Will we continue in the way, or will we go right back to sin? Let's go to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24, and begin in verse 45. And it says, "Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord has set over his household to give them food in due season? Blessed is the servant whom his Lord, when he comes, shall find so doing." And in 47, "Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his property. But if that evil servant shall say in his heart, My Lord delays his coming," I thought it was going to happen in 1980 or 1990 or when the Twin Towers fell, or I thought it was going to happen, 2 years ago. "If my Lord delays his coming, he shall begin to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunken. And the Lord of that servant will come in a day that he does not expect, and in an hour that he does not know, and he shall cut him asunder, and shall appoint his portion with the hypocrites, and there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." This is very similar to what Neil was talking about. This would be a group of people that are for Christ but not with him. At one time, they might have been for him and with him. But when he delayed, what did they do? The same thing that the Israelites did. Made a golden image, gave thanks to a false god, and went on about their life. On a smaller scale, this is exactly what happened in Exodus with Moses, went up to the mountain. Moses delayed his coming. It just took God too long. Can you imagine saying that to God? You just took too long, God. So I decided to do my own thing. This is exactly why, one of the reasons why I believe God delays his coming, is so that we are tested. We're tested in our faith. And the people went right back into their old ways. Why? Because they were living in the moment. Eat, drink, and be merry. But eventually the Lord will return in an hour that they don't expect. And then what happens? Well, let's go back to Exodus chapter 32. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 32 and, pick up in verse 25 of Exodus chapter 32 and read what happens. And we see here Moses comes down. And when Moses saw the people were naked, for Aaron had made them naked to their shame among their enemies. And Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves to him. And he said to them, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, each man put his sword by his side, and go in and out from the gate throughout the camp, and kill each one his brother, and each one his companion, and each one of his neighbors. And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day 3,000 men. Now, a lot of commentaries will use this verse to reference back to the book of Acts, because on the day of Pentecost, when the apostles received the power, there was 3,000 people saved that day, the scripture tells us. And I didn't put it down for us to turn to, but you can turn to the book of Acts and see it. So that here we have in Exodus 3,000 people being put to death for refusing to stand with God. And then, of course, in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, 3,000 people coming to follow God and being baptized and repenting of the sins that they had done. You know, Israel was no longer in physical Egypt, but there were 3,000 people who lost their lives that day because they had brought a little bit of Egypt with them. You think about that for a moment. They weren't physically in Egypt anymore, but those 3,000, had brought some Egypt with them. Very similar to Sarah, when they were leaving Sodom and Gomorrah, what did she do? And there's arguments of, well, she turned around because of this or that. What? God said, don't look back. She looked back at her city being destroyed, and what did she do? She turned into a pillar of salt. In other words, she died for looking back. What principle do we learn during the days of unleavened bread that can help us with this? A little leaven leavens the whole lump. These 3,000 people had a little bit of Egypt that they didn't want to let go. They didn't want to let go of idols. They don't want to let go of, I'll decide how I'll worship God. You know, I've got my way, you know, or as some people say today, my truth. And as a result of that, they lost their lives. Now, in no way am I advocating for us to go out and do that. It's not our responsibility to. It's not our position to. Everybody right now, we are functioning in Satan's world. And so you are free to choose to dance around the idol, if you will, just like they did in Exodus right now. You can dance. You can worship a pagan god. You can participate in pagan activities. You can become a person that says you don't believe in a God at all. You can become an atheist or an agnostic. You can do whatever your heart desires right now. And why? Why are you able to do those things right now? Because the Lord's coming is delayed. It's not here yet. But there will come a point or a time, and we don't know when it will be. It might not be in our lifetime. That, just as Moses said, and Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, who is on the Lord's side, come to me. There'll be a time of reckoning, so to speak. You know, we have once again completed a cycle through God's holy days. And although we know in part, we have to make sure that we remember that there's a great purpose that hopefully our eyes are being opened to. Why is it that you're being called right now? The reason, you know, we're all being called is really for the same reason. It's to hopefully be a son or daughter in God's kingdom. But the route in which we get there is different. because the things that I struggle with are not necessarily the things you struggle with, and vice versa. We've all got different struggles. But in overcoming those struggles, we all end up at the same destination. And that is to be in God's kingdom, to be in the first resurrection, to be among those that are changed in the twinkling of an eye, or to raise up out of the ground at the last trump. And I don't know if you realize this, but I thought about it because, you know, when you go to funerals, you sit there and you think about things. And it kind of hit me that, you know, you're standing in a cemetery and you see tombstones of thousands of people. And some of them might be fresh dirt, and some of them might be bodies that were buried over 100 years ago. And of course, there's people that have been buried in unmarked graves. We don't even know that a person was buried there. And they're asleep. And you know, you think about this, if we understand correctly, when Christ returns and the first resurrection takes place, his kingdom is here on this earth for 1,000 years. And so we don't know when Christ is going to return, but just let's pretend for a minute that he returns tomorrow. First resurrection takes place. There's a lot of things that have to happen before Christ returns, but let's just pretend that it's all happened and he returns tomorrow. First resurrection takes place. His kingdom will be on this earth for 1,000 years. Satan will be locked up, taken out of the way. And do you realize that the second resurrection hasn't even taken place yet until the end of the 1,000 years, if I understand correctly? Is that right now? And so some of the individuals that when we go to put them in the ground, if they weren't being called right now, they could very well be in that ground. If Christ returned tomorrow, they'd be in that ground for another 1,000 years. God's view of time is so different than ours. You know, I was 10 minutes late today. It was a big deal. Or was it? 1,000-year rule. God has his first resurrection. He doesn't even have the second resurrection. We're going to do the second resurrection 1,000 years from now. 1,000 years? You know, 1,000 years? Well, when you have time, like God has, eternity, 1,000 years is as a day, it says in the scripture. You know? And the reason why I bring this up is because the plan that's being worked out here below is a long-term commitment. And it's a plan that we should be thankful for and just thankful to God for, that one, he's opened your eyes to what truth he's opened it to. We know that we know in part. There's things we don't understand. But we need to be thankful for the things we do understand, and to know that we have the opportunity to be a part of that kingdom if we're in the first resurrection, to be able to see God rule for 1,000 years. And then what's another blessing of being in the first resurrection? Another blessing of being in the first resurrection would be you are going to physically get to see the second resurrection take place. Because if you are one of the ones in the ground when the first resurrection takes place, you don't really see it from that vantage point. You're going to see it as you being raised, and that's a marvelous thing. But it looks a lot different when you're up here in the stands and you get to see all the graves open. And people open their eyes for the first time in maybe 5,000 years. And them look around at you and say, How long have I been in the grave? And they think, because they're unaware of the time passing, and we can flip to scriptures to show this, they think maybe they've just fell asleep for 5 minutes. Right? And they've really been in the ground asleep for maybe 3 or 4 or 5,000 years. Is that not amazing? How many billions of people have walked the face of the earth? And this is where men get into problems in past religious and what have you, is because instead of just admiring how complex this is and not knowing how God's going to do it, but knowing He has the power to do it, they try to explain it. And when they try to explain it, they make up stuff. And then the next thing you know, people are like, well, yeah, that's what happens when you die. Well, where is that in here? It's not in there. And so sometimes it's all right for us to say, I don't know how He's going to do it. I have no idea. It doesn't tell us how He's going to do it. It just says He's going to. And I want to be a part of it, and I know you do too. And so one of the things that I was hoping to get from this message is, we just came through the Feast of Tabernacles. We just left the last great day. We just completed God's cycle in His holy days. And now we're back into the weekly Sabbaths. And compare that cycle of us coming out of Egypt. I mean, we were supposed to come out of Egypt a long time ago. At the beginning of Passover, we're supposed to come out of sin. But we've just come out of the keeping of God's holy days and looking forward to the next one. Let's don't be like the Israelites. Don't get caught up in, man, every time we turn around, there's a new war breaking out. There's a new situation breaking out. Is this the end? No, it wasn't the end last time. Everybody thought it was going to be the end on this date. Everybody thought it was going to be in there. And then what do we get caught into? The same thing they did. Moses, where's he at? He's delayed. And that's what we read in Matthew. That servant. The Lord delays His coming, and they say, I tell you what, hand me a Budweiser. Hand me a beer. That's what it's saying. They're drinking, they're married. We'll talk about this some other time. Put that away. We don't need that right now. You can do whatever you want, right? Just live life to the fullest. And you know what great cartoon depicts that? It's an old Disney classic, Pinocchio. Remember when Pinocchio goes to Treasure Island? Or Pleasure Island, not Treasure Island. He goes to Pleasure Island. He goes there and you can do whatever your heart desires. Right? And that's that same, and what is it? The wolf that's trying to trick Pinocchio into doing whatever he wants to do. Right? Well, that